I'm Professor Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency. And I am delighted to welcome you here today for our Fall 22 Political Science Talks Politics lecture. I'm going to say a little bit more about our speaker, Dr. Fritz, and his talk, The Russian Invasion of Ukraine, Causes and Consequences, in a moment. Let me just say that the PSC Talks Politics lecture series was started by the Department of Political Science in the fall of 2019. We decided that this would be instructive for political science faculty to share their scholarly expertise with the community, with the Hofstra community, on different aspects of the presidential election. And since then, we've moved on past the 2020 election to look at key policy debates and political and policy debates. And I'm delighted that several of my colleagues are here today. Dr. Carolyn Dudek, the department chair, was not able to join us, but the department is sponsoring the lecture, and Dr. Dudek delivered a Poli-Sci Talks Politics talk last spring. We also have in the audience Dr. Craig Burnett, who has spoken about the Kalikow School poll for Political Science Talks Politics and polling more generally. Dr. Rosanna Parati, there she is. With the students, Dr. Brody, who's delivered a Political Science Talks Politics lecture on voting rights, and Dr. Stephanie Nanis, who's spoken about, I think it was just last spring, is that correct, Dr. Nanis, on the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. And we've had several other talks as well. I gave one on the first 100 days of the Biden presidency. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Nanis' comparative politics class, Dr. Fritz's, I believe this is the nuclear weapons class, is that correct? Technology and Defense, policy class here today, as well as other students, faculty, and community members here today. Let me tell you a little bit about our distinguished speaker. Dr. Fritz is Associate Professor of Political Science at Hofstra. He studied at the University of Dayton for his undergraduate work, where he was actually thinking about a degree, going to medical school. But I was glad to read in the Chronicle from 2019 that it was a course in American politics that made him decide to turn to political science instead. He went on to receive his PhD from Ohio State University. After that, he went on to pursue a postdoc fellowship at the University of Southern California, and he joined Hofstra at their Center for International Studies, and he joined Hofstra in 2007. Dr. Fritz's areas of research and teaching include international politics, security studies, international organization, and U.S. foreign and defense policy. He has published many articles, including in journals like the Journal of Politics, International Interactions, Foreign Policy Analysis, and other publications. Has written about alliance formation, democratic imposition, and UN Security Council reform. That was for a Kalikow Center conference that Dr. Fritz helped me organize about 12 years ago now, actually, 10 years ago. He has co-edited a foreign policy volume on the George W. Bush administration. That was from Hofstra's conference of the George W. Bush presidency in 2015. And he currently is the research director for the conference of the Barack Obama presidency, which will take place in April of 2023. His current research agenda focuses on how defeated states respond to war-ending settlements with application to Russia in the post-Cold War era. And he was working on this before the Russian invasion of Ukraine last February. Perhaps maybe just as important, if not more so, than Dr. Fritz's extensive research agenda is his teaching. Dr. Fritz has been recognized by students in so many ways for his fine teaching. He received the Mentor of the Year Award in 2016, and the Teacher of the Year Award for the Peter S. Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs in 2019. When he received that award, the Hofstra Chronicle published an interview with Dr. Fritz. You can still find it online. And he made 2 points about what is most important to him about teaching. And he said the first one is giving students the opportunity to speak their minds in the classroom. And the second one is maintaining a high level of empathy. And I can think of no better principles for us to uphold in the classroom than those. And so Dr. Fritz, we are so honored to have our distinguished professor, teacher, scholar, colleague for all of us in political science, Dr. Fritz, speak to us today about his research on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, causes and consequences. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Dr. Bose, for that generous, probably too generous of introduction, but thank you. Thanks also to my colleagues for coming. Dr. News for bringing the class. 113, you're stuck there, so but thank you, but you had your comment. Thank you very much. Thanks to the Cultural Center, Events Management too, for putting this all together. Really appreciate it. The war in Ukraine has been dominating the news, rightly so. And there are lots of open questions we need to be thinking about. What I want to do today is think about the causes of the war from a number of different angles. So we can think about how maybe all of this ends in some ways, right? Because that's the most pressing issue in a lot of ways, is how does this end? So, but let me start by laying out where we are. The 2014 invasion, right? So I can't see the screen, I'm behind it. I may have to check every once in a while to make sure that it's up in the right way. If it looks off, throw something at me to let me know when I need to change something. This is the start of the invasion in February 24th, 2002, or 2022, excuse me. This was a massive invasion. 190,000 Russian troops or so came in from almost every direction towards Ukraine. And this set the stage for where we are today. Now things have changed on the ground, but I want to lay out where we stand in terms of sort of costs so far. This invasion led to Russia taking over about 20% of Ukrainian territory. I'll come back to these other costs. Here what we see, let me just some of this out. This is not actually updated today. There's been movement in Ukraine here, Ukraine up there, taking that territory. But this is 20% of the land mass in the city that was taken over and held by Russian troops. That's significant loss, right, for the Ukrainians. Other figures with this in terms of costs, we think about sort of the military losses so far. This has been an extraordinarily costly war. Ukraine has lost the estimate somewhere 9,000 to 10,000. We don't know how accurate that is. Ukraine is, like most states, hesitant to show how many losses they have. Russia's lost 25,000 is another estimate, maybe many more than this. These are killed in action. There are many thousands more that have been injured. So the costs have been extraordinarily high militarily. Civilians have suffered even more. This is maybe one of the biggest humanitarian crises that we've seen in the 21st century so far, and that's, unfortunately, there's a lot of competition for the worst ones. Over 6 million people have fled, are refugees from Ukraine, fleeing the fighting. 6,000 killed to 9,000 injured. These are just documented numbers, but that the UN can confirm. There's probably many thousands more that have been killed in this war, civilians, right, that are non-combatants. There have been massive human rights abuses during this war. On both sides, to be clear, but much more so from the Russian side. What we've seen from a separate UN report, also released in September 2022, is that there have been summary executions of civilians in Ukrainian-held territory. The town of Bucha, outside of Kyiv, is probably the most prominent, where there are at least 400 unmarked graves. Mass killings of civilians. We're likely to see much more of this as more territory is taken back by Ukraine. The UN report noted that summary executions of civilians in Russian-held territory is widespread. That there has been sexual violence used against civilians on a wide scale. That prisoners of war have been abused on a wide scale. Now both sides have done this, especially with prisoners of war. But the UN report, which generally tries to stay as neutral as possible, does note that there are significantly larger numbers of instances that amount to war crimes on the part of the Russian Federation.
So we're seeing an aggressive war in this sense, and we're seeing really high cost. Why? Why unleash this horror, right? That's the question that we have in so many ways that we need to address. Why did Russia invade? And also related to this, I want to ask sort of why, or am I concerned with the causes of this war? Why not just focus on how this ends? Well, my argument is that we have to understand the causes of war to be able to understand how it can end. What are the possibilities for it to end? So it's worth going through and thinking about what caused this war in the first place, so we can think about possibilities. But I want to make a couple things clear. When we're talking about the causes of war, there's never a single cause of war. War is one of the most complex endeavors humans undertake. There are potentially thousands of variables we would want to look at for the causes of war. So what I want to present here is necessarily incomplete. And there are going to be multiple other theories and ideas out there that I won't be able to cover that might be equally valid. On top of that, this quote here, war can create its own war aim. Sometimes the initial causes of war shift during the course of war. That is, the fighting actually creates new causes in and of itself. So we have to pay attention to those types of factors too. With that said, our best shot at figuring out sort of how this ends is probably still to focus on sort of what were these initial causes, what drove this decision for Russia to invade Ukraine. So I want to do this using, unsurprising to any of my students in the room here, I want to use international relations theory to try to understand what's going on here. Now, there are lots of different theories, there are lots of different ways to approach this. What I'm doing here is going to use levels of analysis to break down different types of theories that focus on different types of issues. Levels of analysis is a basic, classic way to understand different international outcomes. When we look at the individual level of analysis, we're looking at individual leaders and their decision-making processes, their worldviews, their ideas about what is right and what is wrong, all kinds of different factors. When we're looking at the domestic level, we're looking at internal factors or internal attributes of the country and how this can contribute to decisions for war. We're looking at the systemic level, we're looking at sort of the international system itself and how outside forces can drive states to or away from conflict in some ways. So this is a useful approach to try to dissect a very complex events, I think, and we're going to see different theories at these different levels that might help us to understand what's going on. So I want to dive right in with these different levels and different theories. And as I go through these different potential causes of the Ukrainian war, or Russian war in Ukraine, some of them probably sound very familiar to you, that you've heard before. And that's good. What I want to do is sort of systematize things as much as we can to try to be able to think very clearly about the implications of these different explanations. And I want to start at sort of the lowest level of analysis, if you will, but also maybe the most complex in some ways, at the individual level, and focus on Vladimir Putin as the leader of the Russian Federation and his decision-making style. We're focusing first on his worldview, essentially. We know a lot about Vladimir Putin because he's told us a lot about what he thinks is going on in the world. He's very open with this. What he has is an extraordinarily chauvinistic view of Ukrainian history. He, in 2008, told then President George W. Bush, quote, "Ukraine is not a real country." He has stepped up his rhetoric in other ways. After 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the start of war in the Donbass, we've seen a steady building from Putin into sort of it culminated in a 2021 treatise that he wrote, or his propagandist wrote, or whoever, but it reflected his ideas. This treatise was called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Here the assertion was that Russians and Ukrainians are tied together by a common territory, that there's no real territorial divide between Russia and Ukraine, that there's a common language, and there are roots of the common language. Ukrainian and Russian are different, of course, but the root is similar, and there's a lot of cross language spoken within Ukraine. There's lots of Russian speakers in Ukraine. And also tied together sort of Orthodox faith. So this is sort of a picture, sort of Russia that Putin was creating, is that the Slavic people, especially Ukrainians and Russians, are tied together because of all of these factors. But the important thing that he noted was that Russia was the historical leader of all of these people. What he's saying is that those other peoples don't have a right to sovereignty. And he made that very clear, that they do not have a right to sovereignty. This is a very neo-imperialistic view in a lot of ways, right? This is about Russian domination of the neighborhoods, right, along these identity lines. He's expressed a wistfulness for the old empire, both the Russian and the Soviet. A quote from Putin in 2002 or so, I think, I'm forgetting the exact date, said that the Soviet collapse, the collapse of the Soviet state in 1991, was, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So there's, all of this is suggesting sort of we're dealing with a leader that has a worldview that sees Russia's dominance in the region, Russian regional hegemony is another way we can think about it, as rightful, that his mission is to correct the mistakes of past Russian and Soviet leaders, to correct their errors by reclaiming dominance over the near abroad, including especially in Ukraine. This is a stark worldview, right? And this is, again, not been hidden. This is, I put up here, there's a piece by Fiona Hill and Angela Stent in Foreign Affairs called The World Putin Wants. That would be a useful primer to look at if you want to see more about this in this kind of view. But that's sort of what we're dealing with in terms of his leadership. But I want to note something else about his leadership too, and that is about his decision making, which might be just as important, if not more important, than sort of his worldview in a lot of ways. Putin is an autocratic leader, not purely dictatorial, not an absolute leader, but certainly an autocratic leader. He's built up a personalistic authoritarian regime, or semi-authoritarian regime, where anyone in a position of power in Russia owes that position to Putin. They're indebted to him. They survive in power because Putin survives in power in a lot of ways. What he's effectively done is surround himself with yes men, and they're exclusively men, so I'm not, it's in terms of his advisors, who are afraid to question his plans and assumptions because he is this very powerful leader that determines the fate of their fate. This might go a long way to think about sort of this, what in hindsight appears to be a really reckless decision to invade Ukraine. And I want to go back a little bit, in a sense, in thinking about 2014. 2014, Vladimir Putin made the decision to invade Crimea, not with Russian military personnel with carrying the Russian flag, but with what were called little green men. Right? They were Russian soldiers without Russian military insignia on their uniforms. Held a sham referendum after Crimea was occupied and then annexed it. Right? So we're seeing that playbook today again in eastern Ukraine. And this was pretty easy for Putin. This was relatively cheap, relatively quick, relatively painless for the Russian leader. Yes, there were sanctions by the US and the West that imposed costs on Russia, but it didn't really affect Putin in his position, and they weren't that strong as sanctions. So this worked pretty well. So Putin, who's been noted by many who follow him as a risk-accepted leader in 2022, is seeing this possibility to, let's just take more of Ukraine in some ways. And none of his advisors are going to challenge his assumptions about this. And that's the critical thing in some ways. So the lesson he takes from 2014 is this is quick and easy and we can do it again. The Russian military has the military prowess to go in and just destroy a much weaker Ukraine. He's making some really big assumptions there, assumptions that prove to be extraordinarily faulty, assumptions that maybe we we will come to find out hopefully later when we're able to get access to more of this, that maybe not all of his advisors would share, right? What he assumed in a lot of ways that no one was willing to sort of push back on was that the Russian military forces were up to the task. There had been a lot of talk about how Putin had rebuilt the Russian military. And he started this project way back in 2002. 2007, modernization of nuclear forces. After that, after the disastrous performance of the Russian military in 2007, 2008 in the Georgian War, more military or more resources to conventional military forces, more training, more equipment, and all this kind of stuff. Building things up for the past decade plus over time. And so he's thinking that, well, this is going to be easy. Ukraine's weak. But this seriously flawed assumptions about sort of the strength of Ukrainian nationalism, because part of the assumption that going into Ukraine would be easy would be that Ukraine is divided. Ukraine is, and it is to an extent, right? But invasions from the outside tend to create cohesion among even divided states. This was a bad assumption. He also assumed that, like 2014, when NATO didn't really do a whole lot about Ukraine or Crimea, NATO would again not do a whole lot. Well, NATO did respond to the invasion in 2022 in a way that we've never seen before. Maybe most importantly, and what is most hubristic about Putin in some ways, is he thought that the Russian military would be able to just cruise through Kyiv and take the capital and install a very friendly regime. Now, this isn't unique to Putin. Just think of the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States and sort of the hubris that was involved here. Now, the difference is, in 2003, the US actually could go to Baghdad really quickly and take the regime down. It was the hubris, it was afterwards where the hubris really came in, where we thought we could occupy and control Iraq very quickly and easily with very low cost. That's where we were wrong. Putin was wrong at the very beginning, right? The war plan, and if I just go back and show you graphically what this was, I should have had this up earlier. This was directly to decapitate the regime in Kyiv. You didn't need 190,000 troops to be able to do these more limited things in the east or even to take the south. It was a plan to take Kyiv, the capital, and install a different regime. Well, he was tragically wrong about the capabilities of the Russian military to do this. They were stopped short in what those who study war would easily be able to have predicted beforehand just was not going to work. And we can see in hindsight all of the mistakes that were made by Putin thinking that he could do this so quickly and easily. So this sort of focus on Putin is important in a lot of ways, right? It gives us sort of the leader's view, it gives us his decision making, why he thought he could fight this war cheap and easily. It provides a somewhat powerful explanation for what's happening here. But it doesn't cover everything. We need to look at other levels of analysis to be able to think about other causes here. And I want to move on then to the domestic level. And thinking about this domestic level of analysis, the regime type within Russia. Regime type has an effect on how threat is perceived, and it has an effect on how states choose war. This is not in any way earth-shattering. We've known all of this for a long time. There's something called the democratic peace, for example, that it talks about how democracies act differently than non-democracies when it comes to war with other democracies. There's all kinds of lots of research on the performance of democracies and non-democracies at war, showing that democracies actually perform a little bit better at war. So there's a whole body of research that relates to this kind of stuff. But what we're talking about within Russia, it's not a democratic state. We're talking about, as I called it before, sort of a semi-authoritarian regime with very personalistic ties. I have Tim Fry up here as a citation. He has a book from 2021. He's a professor at Columbia. He studied Russia for 40 years. And this book looks at sort of Putin and his role and what it's meant for Russia. And he calls it weak strongman because, yes, Putin is very much a strongman, but he's in a weak position. There are multiple competing centers of power There are different power brokers within Russia that Putin has to keep happy in a lot of ways. We're talking about the intelligence services, the security services, the military, to the oligarchs to some extent, right? The very rich people in Russia who own the state industries, this kind of stuff. So we've got this sort of Putin at the center of it, but there are other actors going along with this that are important to consider. So it's sort of the domestic level of analysis moves us in that direction to look at these other actors. But what we can do with this, right, rather than, I'm not going to do a deep dive on this kind of stuff, but we're going to think about sort of what threatens this type of regime. This is a non-democratic, semi-authoritarian regime. Democracy is what threatens this type of regime in a lot of ways. If we think about regime survival, a semi-authoritarian regime doesn't survive with a democratic movement. We can see this in Russian actions. In 2012, for example, there were demonstrations against Putin's rule and the continued sort of rigging of the elections within Russia. Because, Russia has the trappings of democracy in terms of elections, but they aren't real elections. They're preordained. Everybody knows who's going to win. And people get fed up with this. In 2012, there were, in terms of Russia, mass protests. And what happened? They were crushed, right? The regime struck back. And we see after 2012 crushing of this, protesters, arresting the protesters, many sent to long prison sentences, a systematic effort by the regime to squash other elements of potential democratization within Russia, opposition figures who are calling for more reform. What happens to them? They're jailed or killed, or poisoned, right, and survive. And there's several high instances of this. NGOs that promote transparency, democracy, and other sorts of things that might be based in the US or other countries are expelled from Russia. Right? They're pushed out. They're not allowed to operate because this potentially threatens the hold of the regime if they're pushing for democratic ideas. Michael McFaul is a historian of Russian history and former US ambassador to Moscow too. He's made this case, right? This is really what scares Putin. And in particular, sort of in Ukraine, this is what scares what scares Putin in Ukraine is this movement towards democracy. Now, let's be clear that Ukrainian democracy is imperfect. It's far, far from perfect. It is very problematic in many ways, but it's been steadily democratizing. It's been providing an alternative model to the Russian model in a lot of ways. It's been not just democratizing, but also pushing west. And we can see sort of the origins of the current Ukraine crisis in these dynamics in a lot of ways, right? One way to think about sort of the war today is that it actually started in 2014. And the backstory to this is important. The Maidan protests in Ukraine were mass level protests that united most elements of Ukrainian society, including some pretty nasty elements, by the way, far right wing groups and others, but they were a minority part of this group. And the reason that they protested on this mass level is the president at the time sort of was getting ready to sign an association agreement with the EU to pull Ukraine tighter to the West. And after getting tremendous pressure from Vladimir Putin, the president changed course. And that's what sparked the protest. Eventually, as the story goes, that president sort of, he gives up, he flees. He actually flees to Moscow, right? What Russia calls this, and sorry, let me just take one step back. So with the president gone, a new government is formed in Ukraine, right? Russia calls this a coup, right? It's not a coup, right? A coup is sort of, taking over power by elements of the military or security services and deposing a leader. The Ukrainian leader left and fled to Moscow. It's not a coup, but Russia calls it a coup and responds with aggression towards Ukraine. This is when Crimea is taken. This is when Russia steps up its support for separatists in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. Some people might even say that it was more of a covert war by Russia, because there were certainly elements of the Russian military fighting in the Donbass. They just weren't, again, wearing Russian insignia. this, the Maidan was really sort of a pretty powerful expression by the Ukrainian people of a desire to be affiliated with the West. And this is what sparked this initial hostility towards Ukraine, in terms of open hostility in many ways, partly because sort of what we see is this threatens the Russian regime. We can see then the 2022 invasion, which included this desire for regime change, as a continuation for this. And I brought up this notion of denazification too, because if we're looking at domestic politics, we want to look inside sort of what's going on in Russia and how to justify this. One of the big points that Putin tried to make right before the invasion was that Ukraine was full of Nazis, which was sort of a joke in a lot of ways. Yeah, there are elements of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, but they're not high levels of government. But the reason he brought it up is that resonates deeply with the Russian population. World War II, the Great Patriotic War for Russia, was about fighting Nazis, right? It's hard to express sort of in the Russian collective mind the importance of World War II. It is a day of somber reflection, of celebration that everybody participates in. Putin and other Russian leaders talking about denazification with the Visegrad Group, the first expansion of NATO. These are former Eastern Bloc states that were dominated by the Soviet Union. Later rounds of NATO expansion include Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Republics of the Soviet Union, right? Former states of the Soviet Union, right? Going into former Soviet-dominated territory in 2004. The argument is often made that in 2008, that the George W. Bush administration's insistence that Ukraine be considered a candidate for NATO membership was also sort of driving Russian insecurity. And there's something to that, right? In some ways, that this certainly upset Russia. But the large logic of this type of argument is simply that Russia is being encircled by a US-led alliance. Right? What this is, in terms of international relations theory, it's a very prominent idea, it's a very important idea, it's a very instructive idea, it's something we call the security dilemma. Right? This is what underpins this kind of argument. Security dilemma is simply that actions by one state to increase its security tend to decrease the security of others, whether you intend to do this or not. Right? This security dilemma model sort of envisions a world where all states are defensive in their nature, that they all just want to preserve exactly what they have. And it provides an explanation for why even states like this can sometimes enter into conflict because of the system of international anarchy. There's no guarantee of anybody's safety. One state starts to build its capabilities under a system of anarchy, this can threaten others, right? So the logic behind this kind of explanation that NATO expansion caused this war is purely based upon the security dilemma. And it's very simple. It's very easily applied to the situation. It fits with much of Putin's rhetoric, that the West and the US have been essentially imperialistic, that NATO expansion is bringing the borders of the US even closer and closer to Russia, because NATO is a US-dominated alliance. And Russia had to respond. Russia was forced by this expansionistic policy by the West to make it stop somehow, right? So, simple, attractive, some people have said this is the main cause. I'm not sure. It's clearly caused increased tensions. NATO expansion, Russia has complained about since 1999, right? But at the same time, Vladimir Putin at other times has been pretty nonplussed by it. In 2002, as the Baltic states were getting ready to ascend into NATO, because the process takes a number of years. So this is before they actually came in. He was asked, does this affect Russia? And his answer was something to the effect of, what does it matter to me if Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania join NATO? Right? It just doesn't matter. Putin has been inconsistent in his position on this. When talking about NATO expansion in the context of a Ukraine war, he's highlighted this as sort of a sin of the West in forcing Russia to do this action. At other times, he's cooperated with NATO extensively on certain really important issues, say like counterterrorism after 9/11, and cooperated with NATO in Afghanistan in terms of the operations there that were led by NATO. So there's wild inconsistency with much of this. There's also some problems with this logic too. There's some research, really good pieces that were before the war started by Kim Martin and Bill Woolforth. Talking about NATO expansion, yes, is problematic, but from Kim Martin's perspective, this is just a symptom of bad relations and more a symptom of Russia's decreased status in the post-Cold War world, because what can't Russia do? It can't project power like NATO can. It can't attract allies. How many states are clamoring to be allies with Russia? Not too many, right? But Belarus, yes, Belarus, which is exactly who you want as an ally. Maybe North Korea to some extent as well. That's Martin's perspective. So NATO expansion is a problem, right? But it's a symptom of the larger problem that's driving things. Bill Woolforth makes a case that really what's going on here is not a security dilemma, but because the security dilemma is driven by the status quo concerns and defending what you have, Russia actually wants more. The status quo is Russia not controlling Ukraine, not controlling the Baltics, not controlling Moldova or any place else. That's the status quo. What Russia wants to do is reestablish an old status quo. What that is aggression. Now, the US pushing for NATO expansion might also be seen as an aggression. So he sees this as a competition between two offensively minded states, which is consistent with a theory called offensive realism, that assumes that all states will push as much as they can for regional hegemony because they have to for survival purposes. What that suggests in this case is that we're digging deeper than just the security dilemma dynamic, and is that there's more to the story here. On top of this, just because this has been such a prominent argument that's been made by many people, it's just not clear that the logic works with the security dilemma or NATO expansion being the driving force behind this war. Ukraine was never going to join NATO anytime soon, in the short, medium, or long term. Russia made sure of that in 2014 by invading and taking Crimea and the Donbass. NATO was never going to bring in a state that had a territorial conflict with a nuclear-armed Russia. He had effectively forestalled Ukrainian membership in NATO for the foreseeable future with this frozen conflict. Invading in 2022 further didn't further accomplish that goal. In fact, it set it back, because what happened after Putin invaded Ukraine? Finland and Sweden, historically neutral states, decide to join NATO. Which is completely predictable, by the way, that when one state starts to invade its neighbors, that others are going to look for protection from this, right? So this idea that this outside force was pushing Russia to this war has some very serious flaws. The most fundamental one I would suggest would be this, that the argument about coming from NATO expansion, that this is a security dilemma, is that the expansion of NATO threatens the existence of Russia. And the control of Ukraine through a war to change the regime was necessary for this type of defense of Russia. That presupposes that Moscow has a right to Ukraine, that Ukraine is essentially a rightful possession of Moscow. The only way you can think about NATO expansion, even Ukraine joining NATO, as an existential threat to Russia, is if Russia has defined its existence based upon the dominance of its neighbors. So I find some flaws with this argument at the systemic level. What I think is very fruitful, though, what the systemic level is good at, is thinking about the timing of the invasion. Putin's held, at the individual level, Putin has held these ideas for a long period of time. So why invade in 2022? Can't answer it now. Domestically, it's been similar in Russia for quite a while under Putin's rule, so you can't answer the timing question of why invade in 2022. At the systemic level, we can bring in other factors, right? Because something I haven't mentioned, but is part of this calculation, is sort of the international balance of power. 2022 marks a point where the U.S., the year before, had this chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. China has increasingly challenged the United States in the Pacific and other places. Things seem to be favorable, changing in Russia's favor in 2022, that this was an opportune moment to do this. So the systemic level might give us, if we bring in those kinds of factors, some insights into why Russia chose now to invade. All right, so I'm going to give you one more explanation that bridges the gap between this, but I'm going to go over it really quickly because it's probably the least convincing because it's my own theory. So, and what it is, as Dr. Bo said in the introduction, I study how states react to war-ending settlements. And my basic findings is that all defeated states since 1815 have resisted war-ending settlements, no matter how nice you are to them, right? There's this conventional wisdom in international relations theory that you have to treat a defeated state leniently, or otherwise you'll provoke more resentment and potential revisionism down the road. And everybody looks at Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, as sort of the test case of being too harsh on the loser, and you're going to get a war in a generation later. And there's something to that, but my study has actually shown that even when you're really nice to states, they react very poorly to war-ending settlements. We can go back to Russian history, the Crimean War, the end of the Crimean War. Crimean Wars fought Crimea, between Turkey, Great Britain, France, and Russia on one side. Russia lost this war, right? The war-ending treaty for the Crimean War was such that one member of the British Parliament looked at the treaty and said, I can't tell who won and lost this war because it's so nice to Russia, essentially, right? That was the statement. Didn't matter, though. Russia worked for 20 years to overturn that treaty, and eventually did in 1871 when Europe was consumed by the Franco-Prussian War. So it's just one example of this. Even states that are treated very nicely and when they lose wars resist when they can. The argument that I make is because it is loss, no matter how insignificant the loss, is an affront to the great power identity or status of a state. And I would suggest that this is what we've seen in the post-Cold War system with Russia, that the Cold War was lost by Russia. Yes, thankfully no bullets were fired, but it was a loss by Russia. It was seen as a loss by Russia. And yes, there was loss of empire, but that wasn't imposed upon Russia by outside forces. It happened internally. It was the dissolution of an empire, essentially. Russia kept its Security Council seat, right? It was given access to NATO through the NATO-Russia Council that was created in 1996. So the winning side sort of brought Russia in to give it some political say over the future of this. It was a very lenient settlement. Very generous historically when you compare these elements of a settlement compared to past settlements. It didn't matter, right, to Russia. It rejected this. It rejected its lowered status and position in the international system because of its loss. So what I'm doing here, right, and what this point is saying here is I'm looking at sort of the position of Russia at the systemic level and sort of how a state interprets a war-ending settlement at the domestic level to combine this type of explanation to come up for why Russia may be pushing for war. The implication of this, and I'll just do this quickly, is that Russia is going to act aggressively no matter what the US or the West does. This desire for status and regaining status was likely to drive Russian aggression in former Soviet territories, just like all other defeated states have done. The implication for NATO expansion is this. Rather than being a cause of war, if we run the counterfactual that say Russia still lost the Cold War, but NATO was not expanded after the Cold War, didn't include Poland, Hungary, and other states, what we would have is a much more dangerous situation, where an aggressive Russia intent on remaking the gains it lost would actually face states like Poland and the Baltic states and others who weren't under the protection of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So it would actually potentially be more dangerous. So I'm happy to talk more about that later. I don't want to go on further there. What I want to do is get to what this says about what all of these other explanations say about where we go from here, right? So, one thing I also want to make clear is that all of these theories are probably good at explaining certain things, but they're also probably a little bit wrong about everything too. What we need to do is sort of combine these and think about this. But I want to think about them discreetly, because each theory identifies really important factors contributing to the Russian decision for war and might contribute important features for how this all is supposed to end. So this is kind of quick in some ways. Let me just lay this out here. My theory is not good for the implications of what's happening, right? If Russia's actions to invade Ukraine were driven by a concern for identity status, nothing short of restoring control over Ukraine is going to do that. The war is going to continue until Russia can reach these maximalist ends. We look at sort of this notion of the systemic level and the security dilemma, somehow easing the security dilemma. Well, let me return to the point that sometimes war creates its own war aims. Ukraine is not going to accept this at this point, right? Any sort of easing of the security dilemma might be sort of carving Ukraine up into different territories and giving Russia the east, or letting Russia keep Crimea. Ukraine is not going to accept that at this point in time. The US and NATO are unlikely to accept this at this time. Before sort of the deal, before the war happened, that was maybe in the realm of possibilities. In fact, Russian and Ukrainian envoys came close to that deal the day before the war started. That Ukraine would forego NATO membership, would get security guarantees from other states, and basically give up the Donbass. And Vladimir Putin said no, and fought the war anyway. So it's maybe too late at this point. What this suggests is that assuaging Russian security worries, assuming that they are real, driven by the security dilemma, even if that's the case, it's probably not going to work at this point. At the individual level, if we think about where Putin is, as a semi-authoritarian leader, he's kind of in a real bad spot here. He looks really weak right now because he's not winning. And if he doesn't get gains, he's going to look weaker. So he's going to continue to push, right? All of these theories of the causes of war suggest that this is going to grind on for a long period of time. Now, I want to give you, and I'll say this again later, there are huge caveats. There are things that we can't account for. There might be black swan events where something completely unexpected happens. The Russian state just collapses internally, right? And so we can't account for that with our theories. But keep in mind, something like that could happen. Absent that, though, it looks like things are going to grind on. That said, every war still has to end eventually. Freddie Clay wrote a famous book in 1971 with that title, Every War Must End, and makes the case, and a persuasive case that I agree with, that most interstate wars end with some sort of negotiation. This was true even in World War II when there was this idea of unconditional surrender. It really wasn't unconditional. We negotiated with the Japanese, for example, for conditions, right? There was implicit negotiation even with Germany to do this. There are negotiations. So this is the process by which war ends. The question is how and when. And unfortunately, more recent research on this is not suggestive of a good outcome. What we know is that from work by Chaim Gomans and others that have looked at war termination is that if we look at regime type, there's a difference in how regimes respond to possibilities for negotiation to end a war. Democracies and authoritarian regimes actually act pretty similarly for different reasons. Democracies, if they're in a war that is hurting them, will try to cut their losses because they know that they'll suffer at the ballot box in the next election. Authoritarian regimes don't have to worry about that. And they also don't have to worry about backlash for looking like they lose a war because they're in complete control. So Saddam Hussein in 1991, for example, could negotiate an end with the war with the US because nobody was going to challenge Saddam Hussein's position of power, right? So he could take these big losses and not worry about it. Semi-authoritarian regimes, however, they're the least likely to sue for peace. Semi-authoritarian regimes are in this position where they can't accept anything less than victory because their very position at home is at risk. this is where Putin is in a lot of ways. And what this leads to with semi-authoritarian regimes, and we see this in multiple cases over time, is that they pursue this gamble for resurrection strategy. That is, they expand the war, they escalate the war, trying to impose higher costs on the other side, thinking that they can get the other side to eventually back down if the costs are high enough. So think about what Putin has done in the past few days, past couple weeks, right? The mobilization, partial mobilization, well, it might be full mobilization, right? This is intended to bring in at least 300,000, if not more, military-aged males into the Russian military to be able to send to the front line. The talk of nuclear escalation, right? This is an escalation strategy like this too, thinking that I got to do something. This might scare Ukraine, right, or the West to stop backing, to back this. This might be what we're seeing at this point in time, is this gamble for resurrection. And we know previously from what I said about the individual level analysis, Putin is pretty risk accepting. So it's consistent with this idea that a leader like this, who would be fearful of losing his domestic position, would be willing to engage in this dangerous potential escalation. So it's not hopeful. None of the war termination literature suggests we're anywhere really close to an end here, assuming there aren't, again, some events that we just can't account for that are happening. I hate being the bearer of bad news, but I think that's what international relations scholarship says about this. I don't know of any perspective that suggests that the war is going to end anytime soon. That's probably most likely what's going to happen in terms of the mechanics of the war ending, with absent some sort of dramatic nuclear escalation or some other sort of event we can account for, is a slow meat grinder on the front lines of Ukraine. It might get hot at times and get cool at times. It might be into a frozen conflict, but it's unlikely to end. So this gets into sort of this next issue, sort of where is all of this headed? And I don't know exactly where it's headed, other than I don't think it's headed for any place good. But what I wanted to put out there is that we want to look at the internal dynamics of Russia and Ukraine. This is going to matter greatly. Maybe there are some cracks within the Russian regime right now. There's more discontent because of this idea of mobilization of forces. People don't like the idea of their brothers and sons and husbands and going to fight in a war that they don't quite understand why they're fighting. Right? There's more discontent among the military leadership, right? The military leadership is being blamed for a lot of things. Security services are blaming them. So there's maybe some cracks there. We have to pay attention to that. We have to pay attention to cracks in Ukraine. Ukraine is suffering greatly because of this war. People are going to get tired of this. They are tired of this. Our country only has so much ruin in them, and Ukraine has absorbed a lot of ruin so far. The internal dynamics there in terms of continued support for Zelensky in his position matter greatly. And right now it's not wavering, but it could down the road. The internal dynamics of NATO countries matters too. Right now NATO is extremely unified in providing tons of support to Ukraine. Will that last? If there's a hard right-winger coming into Italy, what's that going to do to this? If the Swedish party, the hard right party in Sweden takes power, is that going to derail some unity in NATO, or maybe even Sweden's entry into NATO completely? The internal dynamics within those countries matter. Within the U.S., we see an element of the Republican Party starting to distance itself from the support to Ukraine. And if that happens, then is the U.S. the biggest, by far biggest contributor of military and other types of aid to Ukraine during this war? That could have devastating consequences. So, beyond the theories, we have to pay attention to these types of things that could potentially affect the outcome. And this is one sort of a wild card here right now, too. The facts on the ground, and this is changing literally every day. This morning, Ukraine reportedly got closer and closer to Kherson, right, a strategic area in the south. Ukraine overtook Lyman, the strategic logistical point in the east, in the Donbass, that was critical to the Russian war effort. If Ukraine keeps making gains, well, then we could be talking about very different dynamics. It doesn't necessarily suggest Russia would be more likely to sue for peace. It might actually see push Vladimir Putin into a corner even more so. But the fact is, Russia could sort of change some of the dynamics. Maybe Russian mobilization actually works. Very few people think it will, but maybe it does, and changes some of the tide, and sort of the conditions on the ground change. There's also this wild card of Russian escalation further, and the next escalation really is the nuclear escalation, right? Maybe not using nuclear weapons, but threatening the use of nuclear weapons. The way that we could see this happening is, okay, Putin has implied the use of nuclear weapons in public speeches multiple times. That's nothing new. But if Russia starts to move around equipment that is related to nuclear weapons, which we can see in satellites, and they would want us to see, that's a signal that they're escalating the conflict, that they might be getting ready to use them in some way. Now, I still think it's very unlikely that they would, but just starting to think about the process of using nuclear weapons is an extraordinarily dangerous escalation because it increases the chances that they will be used. So we've got to keep an eye on this kind of stuff. These are the dynamics sort of that are happening day to day that are going to matter for the where this all ends up. What I want to end with, though, here is thinking about sort of the larger implications for international politics given the Russian invasion and what at least what I think might happen with this. The first is sort of that we are certainly in sort of a new type of Cold War, but it's a very different type of Cold War than the first Cold War. The nuclear balance is the same. Right? The US and Russia both have enough nuclear weapons and will continue to have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the Earth 25 times over, or whatever the figure is now. The only way that's going to be affected is that there's very unlikely to have any sort of arms control negotiations going on between Russia and the US anytime soon. I just can't see that happening. But other elements of the so-called New Cold War are going to be radically different. Russia is at a huge disadvantage. During the first Cold War, Russia had a big strategic advantage of being at the heart of Europe. It's on the edges of Europe now. The front line for the New Cold War in Europe is Ukraine, not Germany. NATO is much bigger than it was at the time. Russia is comparatively much weaker than it was. Russia has no choice except to start looking east. And once Russia starts looking east, it's looking towards China. China growing as this potential hegemon kind of gets to dictate that relationship. And that's exactly what we've been seeing recently. Yes, Russia is pushing towards China. This is going to have implications for sort of the larger international politics, but Russia's going to be a junior partner. And it's going to end up being very dissatisfied by this sort of situation. So yes, there is kind of this new Cold War in some ways. Russia's going to continue to be isolated for the foreseeable future. It's going to be these really nasty dynamics between the US and the rest of the West and Russia. But Russia's at a very big disadvantage in some ways compared to, say, 1945 to 1991. There's also, I was already here. I want to think largely about or even bigger in some ways, in terms of threats to the international order. Now, the international order is what I'm talking about it here, is the largely liberal rules-based order built in 1945 by the United States and its allies. One of the key tenets to this was the essential delegitimizing and outlawing of territorial aggrandizement. Russian invasion of Ukraine affects this greatly. If it succeeds, that key tenet of the post-Cold War order is going to come under a lot of challenge. That is, what it's going to do is legitimize this idea for certain actors that you can take land by force. That this is a way international politics can work. And we've tried to work since 1945 to eliminate that idea. There's a big caveat to that because there have been exceptions. The US, for example, has invaded other countries and violated their sovereignty, but not for the purposes of annexing that territory, right? So there's a radical difference there. Think about sort of other issues too in terms of new alignments and new challengers. Yes, I already mentioned sort of maybe Russia and China are going to grow closer together, but Russia's not going to be advantaged in that position. The other thing I'll point out is that even though there may be challenges to the rules-based international order of post-1945, it's also being strengthened in some way. things. The unity among NATO members and EU members generally, and this, let's just say the North Atlantic community, as at a level that we have not seen in the post-Cold War world. If Putin was trying to destroy Western unity, he had the exact opposite effect with his invasion in really bringing them together. So there are these multiple forces pushing in different directions in terms of the future of international politics that we'll have to kind of wait and see where it all goes. So with that, I just want to end because I've already talked way too long, I'm really looking forward to any questions or comments or discussion that you have. So I guess there's a microphone, so if you want to come up to, or Dr. Bose, is there?
Just go ahead. Actually, you know what? I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to speak ahead of you for one thing and go, but you'll go for next. So thank you, Dr. Fritz. That was, I didn't see a question you want to talk about.
Thank you, Dr. Fritz, for a very instructive, albeit sobering talk. I'm just gonna ask a quick question and turn it over to the students. We have about 15 minutes here because we have a hard stop at about 12:40 because Dr. Fritz has another class. So you've explained so cogently the many, the international relations theories about the causes for the Russian invasion, and which ones you find more persuasive. I'm curious as to what you would say about why the invasion took place when it did. I'm still wrestling with that. Why February 2022? Why not earlier? Why not wait? And then along with that, whether you think the United States or other actors in the international community could have done anything to prevent the invasion. I know you've argued against the fact that NATO expansion was the reason, but or were there could there have been other strategies to prevent that? Thank you. And then after that, I want to come up and
Thank you, Dr. Bose. Those are great questions. They're really hard to answer. So in terms of why it happened when it did, I think we have to wait to get a full answer on this. But I do think that sort of there are some, if we look at big trends in international politics, Putin may have been able to discern that the U.S. had been on a decline, right? And that especially NATO unity had been really tested by the Trump administration, and it wasn't clear that that had been repaired yet. So maybe this was just an opportunity to do this. Now, it sort of, this has come up for others, and why didn't Putin do this when Trump was president if it was the same issue? Because the reaction would have been radically different. And it's not clear, right? To me, why that wouldn't be. So I think we'll have to get more information in terms of the decision-making from Putin. You know, it's plausible that it was, if Trump won a second term, he had told his advisors that he was planning on getting out of NATO. Now I don't know how much this actually, how true this is, and how if he could have actually done it without massive political repercussions. But no matter what, Trump was so disruptive to the North Atlantic community, the further weakening of this with a second term of Trump would have been advantageous to Putin. When it didn't materialize, maybe that's part of it. I don't know, that's speculation, but I think it's a really important question that we'll have to get to. The other really tough question, could there have been anything else to prevent this? The US tried very hard to deter this invasion from happening. We saw this really remarkable strategy that we really haven't seen before by the Biden administration. When they were publicly putting out all this intelligence about what Russia is going to do, right? So we saw this intelligence about troop movements, that this is the Russian war plan, and in fact it was the Russian war plan that they had found out and then politicized. Right? So this was pretty fascinating to do this, but it still failed. So trying to deter Putin from doing this was very extraordinarily difficult. It didn't necessarily help that Ukraine played down those threats publicly, that Germany and France also played down those threats publicly. Now, had they been more receptive and talked about them openly, I don't know if it would have changed the calculus or not, if it would have increased the strength of the deterrent signal that they were trying to send. It's hard to know. I have my doubts on whether any type of continuation of talks to what was called the Minsk and Minsk II agreements between European leaders and Russia, whether this would have actually led any place, because the argument from Russia was that Ukraine was not following through with its duties in Minsk I and Minsk II to try to have referenda within the Donbass regions. Ukraine was saying that, well, you're still supporting rebel forces fighting against Ukrainian forces in the Donbass region, and we can't exactly do this. So pursuing negotiations and strategies that way, I'm not sure was extremely fruitful. The other route that people have talked about was, before the war started, let's just neutralize Ukraine. Of course, there's a report that effectively Putin rejected that, but that's also really problematic in some ways, right? Because it's taking away agency from Ukraine. You can't just say, okay, Ukraine, you're going to be like Austria was after World War II. Austria was completely neutralized because it was part of the Nazi Axis, right? And had actively participated in World War II with Nazi Germany. And it was part of the defeated coalition. So that model just doesn't work in some ways. And what it would do would legitimate the threat of a territorial invasion to be able to get concessions from a smaller state. And I think that would have damaged the international order in such a way that the US and its allies would not have gone for it, that Ukraine obviously would not have gone for it. It would be such a violation of its sovereignty. But also, large numbers in the international system, small states especially, would see that as a really bad precedent, that they could just be bullied, essentially, by a stronger neighbor. So I'm never one to say that something is preordained, but I think it would have been very hard to stop this war. I think the decision was made by Putin, and it would have been really hard to derail that decision.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor. I know you spoke on this before, but late last night there was a report that a Russian nuclear convoy was on its way west towards Ukraine.
Right.
What do you think the global response to that should be, and what do you think it will be? Because I know those aren't exactly the same sometimes.
Good question, Jake. It's a tough one. Now, I saw that report too, and the experts that I follow aren't entirely sure it was actually a nuclear convoy, but let's assume that it was. That's a bad signal if it actually was, right? That's if Russia has started to put in place what would effectively be a small nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon, as they're sometimes called, into some place where it could actually be used. This is a dramatic escalation, as I previously talked about. If it's not used, the response from the international community won't be anything at all, right? In the sense it will say, I'm sure that there'll be statements about how this is dangerous and unnecessary and all of this, but there won't need to be any sort of military response. If it is used, that's where things become difficult. So say Russia decides to use a small tactical nuclear weapon to try to make some battlefield advantage, which honestly, there isn't much battlefield advantage to using nuclear weapons, because what's going to happen is even a small tactical nuclear weapon, they're either going to kill a lot of their own soldiers if they're on the front line, or the radiation is going to go back into Russia, right, depending on the prevailing winds, and they're going to create a place on the front line that nobody can go to for years, right? So militarily, it doesn't make any sense to do this. So let's assume that they use it more in a demonstration effect, maybe in an uninhabited region away from the front lines, away from large population centers, maybe someplace in the Black Sea that is sort of desolate and nobody's around, so they can say, hey, look, this is what we have, this is what we could use. I think, depending upon the scale of it, and whether it's sort of a demonstration effect or a battlefield effect, there's going to be variation. If it's a battlefield effect, that's going to be the first use of nuclear weapons during wartime since 1945. There's going to be a swift and strong reaction. Would that include nuclear escalation by the US? No, I don't think so. I will say David Petraeus, the former General David Petraeus, made pretty irresponsible statements over the weekend about how the US would respond to Russian use of nuclear forces, and saying that we would just, we'd be able to take out all Russian military units and Ukraine and maybe take out the Black Sea fleet, Russia's Black Sea fleet. That's just escalatory logic that's going to lead to an actual nuclear war. So what the US would have to do would be to calculate things. What type of response is not going to trigger further escalation by the Russian side? It could be, what we could see would be something like political rather than military. If a battlefield nuclear weapon is used, bring Ukraine into NATO immediately. Because what that means is if they escalate further and use another one, Article 5 kicks in, and Ukraine is part of NATO, an attack on Ukraine at that point is an attack on all countries. So Russia is sort of, that's escalatory too, right? And really dangerous. But Russia using a battlefield nuke would set that in motion as really dangerous in itself. These are the things that I'm sure, I hope, I pray, that the Biden administration is sort of gaming out right now. And in fact, multiple reports on it, they are. So let's hope they get it ready. Thank you for the question.
So, at the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion,
Good
there
day.
was the sentiment going around in the United States kind of echoing the thoughts that we should reduce our foreign involvement, kind of echoing involvement completely. However, as the war continued, that sentiment seemed to have faded. Is American involvement, would be my question, is American involvement in international affairs integral to preserving our deteriorating hegemonic position, or would a policy of limited or non-involvement be more beneficial?
It's a great question. It's a big question. It's a fundamental question. So, in a number of things, depends on how you define involvement, right? Involvement could be deep engagement with allies, but in a multilateral way. Involvement could be supplying Ukraine with billions of dollars of military equipment and other things, and there's a big gulf between those types of things. But the fundamental debate that you're alluding to sort of is U.S. deep engagement versus a little bit more of a retrenchment. Or at least that's the way I'm interpreting your question. Is that fair? And here I think that there are arguments that there are legitimate arguments and valid arguments on both sides. U.S. deep engagement is predicated on this idea that the U.S. is acting as a type of hegemon to support the liberal rules-based order that has actually been extremely beneficial for most of the world since 1945, in the U.S. in particular. That's not to say that there haven't been costs, and not to say that there haven't been those that have lost because of this, but in the aggregate, we've seen more wealth created, we've seen fewer conflicts, and better life expectancy, every sort of indicator of goodness and happiness has increased in that period of time. And the U.S. has benefited most from this. So that deep engagement in terms of engaging allies, supporting allies has been great in that regard. At the same time, what it's done is create a system where the U.S. is the lightning rod for every malcontent in the international system, right? Every problem that appears in the world can be blamed on the U.S. Whether this is, and we've seen this sort of post 9/11, this was a big discussion where sort of the U.S. became this symbol of U.S. dominance and hegemony, became this a symbol of discontent for especially those in the Middle East, right? That the U.S. was controlling things and the U.S. needed to be pushed out and U.S. hegemony reduced. There's arguments about the cost of this deep engagement, right? And specifically the opportunity cost. So if we're spending $900 billion a year on defense spending, and several $100 billion more on intelligence and homeland security and all this kind of stuff predicated on this deep engagement, well, it means we can't spend the money on other things, right? So we're losing the opportunity cost. So it's what I would say is I think that that's a question the American people have to start asking more so of their elected leaders and push them on this, because that is a basic political decision that democracy, where that should lie with the people in a democracy, more than sort of having just. Thank you for that great question.
I think this will be the, please, go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I took 2 pages of notes filled with facts and I think good information. You mentioned all the different topics, decision-making, regime, and the system around the world. I want to talk about energy, and my question is, I believe under the Trump administration, the US put sanctions on Russia specifically to limit his ability to get money from oil to bring the price down, because money coming into Russia is his ability to wage a war. So I was curious about your comments on the current administration's policy of limiting our energy production. We used to be energy independent, now we're not, and so now NATO and the countries of Europe are looking to Russia for oil, and that sort of complicates the situation. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
I think that that's a really important issue, right? Because if we look at the Russian war machine is fed by oil. There's no doubt about this. And oil makes the entire world economy run. Hopefully that'll change sometime when we get on fossil fuels, but right now, as it stands, it isn't. So you mentioned sort of Trump administration sanctions on the oil sector, and I'm not recalling it. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm just not recalling exactly what that is. But I can think more specifically about sort of what the Biden administration has done in this regard. And here I would say it's sort of a challenge, because the world needs oil, but Russia's supplying a lot of this oil, and you need to punish Russia for this invasion. How do you do that without cratering the world economy, right? Without creating the European economy in particular? Because even if the U.S., let's say the U.S. is completely energy independent for a moment, and just say we're not relying on any imports. And the imports actually vary upon different uses of natural gas and oil, different types and that kind of stuff. The European economy cratering is really bad for the U.S. economy in that regard. So striking that balance was something I think the Biden administration felt like they absolutely had to do. So what you've seen is sort of sanctions, yes, but not full-blown, right? It's not an embargo. Russia can still sell oil, and it can still sell natural gas in certain contexts in certain areas. China has picked up a lot of this slack too. And I guess that's the other thing that I would bring in, is that if the US decided to cut off completely, Russia would have alternatives to be able to go. And maybe not good alternatives, because what we've seen is China take advantage of Russia and its position by demanding that the natural gas that China is going to continue to buy from Russia at a discounted price. So Russia's stuck, right? They can't sell as much to the West before, they got to sell it to somebody. China's saying, you got to give us a deal on it, right? So they're not making as much. So I wish I had a better answer to your question. I think that this is a terribly complex issue that has been, it's been a struggle, it's going to continue to be a struggle, especially as winter sets in Europe and Germany gets really cold. Because it's not going to be just about oil then, but it's going to be about German support for the NATO involvement with Ukraine and support for Ukraine. Because they're going to start paying a really high cost in some ways. So thanks for the question and then for that important point to be thinking about.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to have to close the questions now, but our time is coming to an end for this. So please join me in thanking Dr. Fritz for a very instructive
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Dr. Bozeman.
I think we would have asked you to do part 2 in the spring